The America of the early 1980s was sold as a comeback story. After years of inflation, oil shocks, and political scandal, a former Hollywood actor stepped into the White House, promising renewal. Ronald Reagan spoke of optimism, strength, and freedom. His speeches were filled with sunshine and simple solutions. For many Americans, it felt like hope had returned. But beneath the optimism, policies were taking shape that would quietly restructure the country for generations, shaping why life feels harder today. Reagan entered office in 1981 during a time of economic anxiety. Inflation was high, unemployment hovered near 7%, and trust in government was low. His answer was a dramatic shift in economic philosophy. Instead of government spending and regulation, Reagan championed supply-side economics, the idea that cutting taxes on corporations and the wealthy would lead to investment, job creation, and prosperity that would trickle down to everyone else. Within his first year, the Economic Recovery Tax Act slashed the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50% later, dropping it to 28% by the end of the decade. Corporate taxes were reduced, capital gains were favored, and regulations were rolled back across industries. Supporters praised these moves as pro-growth. Critics warned they would widen inequality. Over time, the numbers told a clear story. Productivity rose, but wages for average workers barely moved. During the Reagan era, worker productivity increased by more than 15%, yet real wages for most Americans stagnated. Meanwhile, income for the top 1% grew dramatically. In 1980, the top 1% earned about 10% of national income. By the early 1990s, the share had climbed sharply, setting a pattern that would accelerate in the decades to come. The American middle class, once the engine of prosperity, began to hollow out. One of the most defining moments of Reagan's presidency came in 1981, when over 11,000 air traffic controllers went on strike demanding better working conditions. Reagan fired them all and banned them from federal service. It was a clear message. Organized labor no longer had the government's backing. Union membership began to decline rapidly. In the 1950s, more than 30% of American workers were unionized. By 1980, that number was around 20%. Today, it sits near 10%. The decline of unions meant weaker bargaining power for workers. Benefits shrank, job security disappeared. Wages stagnated even as corporate profits soared. Reagan's administration also loosened antitrust enforcement, allowing corporations to grow larger, consolidate industries, and reduce competition. This set the stage for the dominance of megacorporations that now shape everything from food prices to housing costs. Social spending was also reshaped. Reagan reduced funding for welfare programs, housing assistance, and mental health services, arguing that government aid created dependency. Federal support for affordable housing dropped sharply throughout the 1980s. At the same time, homelessness surged. By the late 1980s, estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of Americans were homeless on any given night, a phenomenon rarely seen at that scale since the Great Depression. Education followed a similar path. While college costs rose steadily, public investment declined. In the 1970s, many public universities were heavily subsidized by state governments. By the end of the Reagan era, students were increasingly expected to pay the costs themselves. This shift laid the groundwork for today's student debt crises, where Americans collectively owe over $1.7 trillion in student loans. The Reagan era also reshaped government priorities. Military spending soared. Defense budgets increased by more than 40% during his presidency, justified by Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, domestic programs faced cuts or stagnation. The national debt, once seen as dangerous, tripled during the 1980s, rising from roughly $900 billion to over $2.6 trillion by 1989. The idea that tax cuts would pay for themselves proved false. Culturally, Reagan promoted a vision of individualism. Success was framed as personal virtue and failure as personal fault. Structural issues like racism, inequality, and access to opportunity were downplayed. This mindset reshaped American politics. Problems once addressed collectively were redefined as individual responsibilities. Healthcare, education, housing, and retirement increasingly depended on personal wealth rather than public systems. For younger generations today, the legacy is unmistakable. Housing costs have skyrocketed. Adjusted for inflation, median home prices are more than twice what they were in 1980. Healthcare costs consume a larger share of income. Job stability is rare. Gig work replaces careers. Pensions have vanished, replaced by risky individual retirement accounts tied to volatile markets. The Reagan era did not cause every modern problem, but it marked a turning point. It changed how Americans think about government, labor, wealth, and responsibility. Policies once considered extreme became normal. Corporate power expanded. Inequality deepened. Safety nets weakened. And each decade since has built on that foundation. Many of today's political debates about taxes, unions, healthcare, housing, and student debt trace directly back to choices made in the 1980s. 4. Young people asking why life feels harder despite working more. The answer is not personal failure. It is historical design. Reagan's presidency reshaped America forever, not through one dramatic moment, but through a quiet rewriting of priorities. Understanding that era is not about nostalgia or blame. It is about recognizing how systems are built, how power shifts, and how decisions made decades ago still shape everyday life. History doesn't just live in textbooks. It lives in rent checks, pay stubs, and debt statements. And the Reagan era is one of the clearest examples of how a single presidency can change the future long after the speeches fade.